Request confirmation of credentials a third time. Our records show no military designation attached to this individual, no command history, no combat rating of any kind. I am transmitting the biometric scan again in case of translation error, because if this is correct, then either humanity has made a catastrophic diplomatic mistake, or we have fundamentally misunderstood what they consider their most dangerous. And she has not stopped smiling since she stepped off that shuttle, which is, if anything, the detail I find hardest to explain in this report. Nobody on the Varan assembly staff who filed that message ever fully recovered their footing after the woman in question arrived, and by the time the whole affair was finished, several of them privately admitted they weren't sure they wanted to. The Varan assembly had spent 4 years preparing for first contact with Earth, and every hour of that preparation rested on a single assumption nobody thought to question: that whoever humanity sent to meet them would be their strongest. It was not an unreasonable assumption. Among the 7 species of the assembly, first contact protocol had always worked this way. The Kathes sent their eldest war priest, whose scarred hide told the story of 4 campaigns before anyone exchanged a single word. The Asuvai sent their fleet marshal, a being whose reputation alone had ended 2 border conflicts before a shot was fired. Diplomacy in assembly tradition began with a demonstration. Here is our best, and you should understand exactly what you are dealing with. Earth had been under long-range observation for the better part of a decade, ever since a damaged Varan survey drone limped home with grainy footage of a species that fought its own wars constantly, viciously, and with a technological ingenuity that alarmed every analyst who reviewed the data. The Assembly's threat models were unambiguous. Humanity was violent, resourceful, and dangerously unpredictable. Precisely the kind of species First Contact Protocol existed to manage carefully, and precisely the kind of species the Assembly expected to meet with its most formidable representative. So when the human shuttle finally settled onto the receiving platform above Assembly space, and the boarding ramp lowered to reveal a single figure, an elderly woman, silver-haired, moving with the unhurried care of someone whose knees had opinions about stairs, carrying nothing more threatening than a canvas tote bag and what appeared to be, of all things, a paperback book, the assembled Varan Honor Guard did not know what protocol covered this, because no protocol did. Her name, according to the credentials that followed her aboard, was Elinor Voss. Her official designation, when the Assembly's translation systems finally rendered it correctly, made even less sense than her appearance. Head Archivist, Boston Public Library System, retired. Special Envoy, Terran Unified Contact Office. There has been an error, said Assembly Coordinator Thes Val Oren, the ranking Varan official present after a long, careful silence. We were led to understand humanity would send its finest. Elinor Voss adjusted her glasses, looked around the gleaming reception hall with the mild, unhurried interest of someone examining a slightly unusual reading room, and smiled in a way that made 3 separate members of her honor guard reach, out of pure instinct, for weapons they had been specifically ordered not to bring. "Oh, I am their finest," she said, "just not in the way you're expecting." To understand why Earth had done what it did, the Assembly eventually had to understand something about humanity that no amount of long-range surveillance had ever captured. That the species fighting its endless, vicious wars down on that blue and green world had also, quietly in parallel, spent 10,000 years building the single largest, most stubborn, most cross-referenced accumulation of recorded knowledge that any Assembly analyst had ever encountered in any spacefaring civilization's history. Every war humanity fought, it also documented. Every mistake, it eventually wrote down somewhere, in some archive, in some format that some librarian somewhere had spent a career making sure future generations could actually find again. Humanity's violence was real. So less visibly was its obsession with never quite letting anything be forgotten. Elinor Voss had spent 41 years of her professional life as the head of acquisitions and special collections for one of the oldest public library systems in North America. She had spent the 20 years before that as a field archivist, cataloging collections in conflict zones on 4 continents. Working, this detail took the assembly considerably longer to fully appreciate inside active war zones, salvaging records that armies on both sides of a given conflict were actively trying to destroy, because she had come to believe over decades of practice that the destruction of a people's records was very often a more permanent atrocity than the destruction of their buildings. She had been recruited to the Terran Unified Contact Office not because of any diplomatic training, she had none, but because, when the office's selection committee sat down to determine who among humanity's citizens actually understood, at the deepest level, how civilizations rose, fell, remembered, forgot, forgave, and repeated their own mistakes across centuries, one name kept appearing at the top of every list assembled by people who studied exactly that question for a living. "You want to know why we sent her instead of a general?" the head of the contact office told a skeptical UN Security Council 3 days before Aliner's departure, in a meeting later declassified and much quoted. "A general can tell you how humanity fights. Aliner Voss can tell you why we've never actually stopped, no matter how many times we've sworn we would, and more importantly for the people about to meet her, she can tell you what it takes to make us stop for good. Generals win wars. People like Aliner are the reason so few of our wars have ever stayed won." Not everyone on the assembly side was willing to extend Aliner Voss the patient curiosity that Coordinator Thes Val Oren eventually did. The Kathes' eldest war priest, an aging warrior named Vorik Thal Senu, whose scarred hide had been offered in assembly tradition as its own kind of credential for 3 separate first contact missions before this one, made his skepticism plain within the first hour of Aliner's arrival, in front of the full assembled honor guard. "This is an insult," he said, in the low, gravel-worn voice that had once, according to assembly legend, ended a mutiny with a single sentence. "Your species sends an old woman with a book bag to meet warriors who have bled for their people. Either you believe us beneath a proper envoy, or your civilization does not understand what it is walking into." Aliner did not flinch and did not raise her voice to match his. "I understand exactly what I'm walking into," she said. "I've spent my whole career walking into rooms where the person with the scars wanted to be taken seriously and the person with the books looked like she didn't belong there. I'll tell you what I've learned, Vorik Thal Senu, for whatever it's worth to you. The scars tell you what a person survived. They don't tell you what actually kept the people around them from tearing each other apart afterward. I'm not here to compete with your credential. I'm here because my civilization decided, after a great deal of argument, that yours needed the other kind." Vorik Thal Senu did not accept this immediately, and for the better part of 2 weeks made no secret of his continued doubt, attending Aliner's early meetings with visible, arms-crossed impatience, waiting, several observers later admitted, for the moment her lack of any real authority would finally reveal itself as the diplomatic liability he was certain it represented. That moment never quite arrived in the way he expected. It was replaced, instead, 6 weeks later by a considerably more uncomfortable one. The moment his own people's founding grievance, the one his entire war priest lineage had spent 2 centuries quietly nursing without ever naming aloud, was finally spoken plainly in a room by the one envoy in assembly history who had arrived carrying no weapon capable of being mistaken for a threat. The first 3 days of Aliner's presence on assembly territory unfolded like a diplomatic assignment gone gently, bewilderingly wrong. At least by every metric the assembly's protocol officers knew how to measure. She asked no questions about weapons capacity. She showed no interest in touring assembly shipyards, a courtesy every previous first contact delegation had specifically requested within the first hour of arrival, in order to properly calibrate the balance of power before negotiations began. Instead, on her first morning aboard the assembly's central station, she asked, with the same mild persistence she had once reportedly used to track down a missing 16th-century manuscript through 3 different national archives, whether the station had a library. It did not in any sense she meant. It had a data repository, vast, efficient, algorithmically organized, entirely inaccessible to anyone without proper security clearance and a specific query already formed. Aliner spent an afternoon being walked through it by a bewildered assembly records officer named Sevit Kor-Alan, who found himself, by the end of the tour, answering questions he had never been asked by anyone in his 11 years managing the repository. "How do you know what you don't have?" she asked him, standing in front of a console displaying a search interface that assumed, by its very design, that anyone using it already knew exactly what they were looking for. The Sevit blinked. "I am not sure I understand the question. If nobody's looking for something, and your system only responds to specific queries, how does anyone ever discover a gap, a missing record? Something that used to exist and doesn't anymore, that nobody's thought to ask about in years, because everyone's forgotten there was ever anything to ask." He had no answer for her, because the question had genuinely never been asked of him before in 11 years of service. It would be asked again 6 weeks later in a context that made its full weight devastatingly clear. But neither of them knew that yet, standing in a quiet archive room discussing what amounted on the surface to library science. "We do not generally worry about that," Sevit said eventually. "The assembly has been stable for 3 centuries. We do not lose records." Aliner smiled the same mild smile that had unsettled her honor guard on arrival. "Everyone says that," she said, "right up until they discover exactly what they lost." Sevit Kor-Alan did not expect to become part of this story at all. He had spent 11 years managing a repository nobody questioned, in a career he had chosen precisely because it seemed safely removed from anything political, anything that might require the kind of judgment calls he had watched consume other, more ambitious officers. What Aliner's visits to the archive room slowly revealed, over the weeks that followed, was that Sevit's own family carried a small, private version of exactly the wound she had been describing to coordinator Thes Val Oren in more abstract terms. His grandmother had been part of the original K-Thes delegation present at the second compression arbitration, not a signatory, but an aide present in the room who had spent the rest of her long life saying almost nothing about what she witnessed there, except once very late in her life to a much younger Sevit, a single sentence he had never repeated to anyone and had never fully understood. "We did not sign that agreement freely, and everyone in that room knew it, and everyone in that room has spent every year since pretending otherwise." He told Aliner this on the 4th week of her visits to the archive, not because she asked him directly, but because she had, by then, spent enough patient afternoons treating him as someone whose observations mattered that the sentence came out almost before he decided to say it. Aliner did not treat the disclosure as intelligence to be filed away. She set down the tea she had, by then, made a habit of bringing with her and simply asked, did she ever get to say that to anyone who could actually do something about it? "No," Sevit said. "She died believing it would only make things worse to say it plainly." That's usually what people believe, right before the thing they didn't say plainly comes back anyway worse, wearing a different name. Aliner was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you to testify to anything, Sevit. I'm asking whether you think your grandmother would have wanted the truth of that room finally written down somewhere findable, even if it embarrassed everyone still alive to read it." Sevit thought about this for a long time before answering, in the careful, deliberate way Threk, no, Varen, his own species, considered any statement that could not be quietly retracted later. "I think," he said finally, "she spent her whole life being the only person who remembered it correctly and dying without ever getting to put it down. I think that might be worse than the embarrassment." It was Sevit's quiet testimony, given formally 3 weeks later during the standoff that nearly broke the assembly apart, that provided the single piece of corroborating detail that made Aliner's larger historical account impossible for either fleet commander to dismiss as an outsider's speculation. He did not do it for glory. And the Assembly's own records note that he requested, and was granted, no public credit for the disclosure at all. He did it, in his own words, filed quietly in a personal log Aliner would only read months later, so that my grandmother would finally, after 80 years, get to be right out loud instead of only in a private conversation nobody else ever heard. The true purpose of Aliner Voss's mission became clear only gradually, and only to those Assembly officials patient enough to actually listen to what she was doing instead of waiting for her to reveal some hidden military credential that would finally make sense of her presence. She was not there to negotiate a treaty in the way the Assembly understood treaties: territorial boundaries, resource allocation, military non-aggression clauses. She had been sent, quite specifically, to do the one thing Earth's contact office had determined mattered more than any of that in the long run: to find out in exhaustive, patient, cross-reference detail exactly how the Assembly's 7-member species had come to coalition at all, and precisely what had almost broken that coalition in the past. Every alliance that's ever formed between separate peoples eventually gets tested, she told Coordinator Tess Val Oren 3 weeks into her stay, over the kind of quiet afternoon tea that had somehow become a fixture of her schedule despite no protocol document anywhere calling for it. Not by outsiders usually, from inside. Somebody remembers an old grievance wrong. Somebody's ancestors did something that got smoothed over in the official record but never actually healed in the parts of the population that lived through it. I'd like to know what those places are for you. Not because I want to exploit them. Because if Earth is going to build something lasting with the Assembly, I need to know where the cracks already are so we don't accidentally step on one without knowing it's there. Tess Val Oren, who had spent 3 decades in Assembly diplomatic service without once being asked this question by any delegation, found himself over the following weeks doing something he had never expected to do with a human envoy: telling her things. He told her about the second compression, the founding crisis that had nearly broken the Assembly apart before it properly formed, a dispute between the Kathes and the Asuvai over resource allocation that had, in the official Assembly history, been resolved cleanly through arbitration. It had not, in fact, been resolved cleanly at all. Aliner's careful, patient questions, the same instincts that had once let her track a forged provenance record through 6 library systems across 2 continents, eventually surfaced a detail that had been quietly smoothed out of every official Assembly account for over 200 years: that the arbitration settlement had been reached only after a Kathes delegation was, in essence, coerced into signing under a threat that both species had since agreed, tacitly, never to formally acknowledge. It is not something either species discusses, Tess Val Oren admitted some weeks into their conversations, in a tone that suggested he had not fully realized, until saying it aloud to her, how strange it was that an entire coalition's founding document rested on an event nobody was permitted to name. The wound healed. Discussing it seemed likely only to reopen it. Wounds that get talked about heal straighter, Aliner said. Wounds that just get covered over tend to warp the bone underneath. I've watched it happen with human treaties for 60 years. Whatever gets left unspoken at the founding of something always comes back later, usually at the worst possible moment, dressed up as something else entirely. She was, though nobody in the Assembly recognized it yet, describing exactly what was already quietly happening 2 systems away. The crisis that would test everything Aliner Voss had spent her first 6 weeks quietly gathering began, as these things nearly always do, somewhere far from the negotiating table entirely. A faction within the Kathes military command, old guard traditionalists who had never fully accepted the second compression settlement, though Assembly records showed no formal objection on file from any of them, had spent the better part of a decade quietly building a case, entirely within their own closed channels, that the Asuvai had never actually honored the spirit of that 2-centuries-old arbitration, and that the coercion the 2 species had agreed never to discuss represented a debt still owed, one that a new generation of Kthess officers believed it was finally strong enough to collect. They moved on a mining consortium jointly operated by Kthess and HFY interest in a system 3 jumps from Assembly Central Command, seizing it under a legal justification so obscure and so carefully worded that it took Assembly legal analysts nearly 2 full days to determine it was, in fact, an attempt to reopen the second compression settlement by force, rather than the minor jurisdictional dispute it had first appeared to be. The HFY Fleet Marshal, the same formidable figure whose reputation had once been offered, in the Assembly's own founding logic as proof of strength, mobilized a response fleet within hours. And for nearly 36 hours, the coalition that had held for 3 centuries stood closer to open civil conflict than at any point since its founding, with every Assembly military analyst reaching the same grim conclusion. Neither side could back down without appearing to concede the very grievance both had spent 200 years agreeing never to name, and the longer neither side spoke plainly about what was actually being fought over, the more certain conflict became. It was Elinor Voss, of all people with no military authority, no formal negotiating mandate for a crisis of this scale, and nothing resembling the kind of credential the Assembly's own protocol would have required of anyone attempting to mediate it, who requested, and was eventually granted, out of sheer desperation more than confidence, a channel to both fleet commanders simultaneously. "I am not here to tell either of you who was wronged 200 years ago," she said, in the recorded transmission that Assembly historians would later study more closely than almost any other document from the entire First Contact period. "I don't have standing to make that judgment, and frankly, I don't think either side actually wants an outsider making it for them. What I can tell you is what happens to people, any species. I've seen it in more human archives than I can count, when they spend 2 centuries agreeing not to speak about the thing that's actually driving the disagreement underneath every other disagreement they have. It doesn't go away. It just puts on a different uniform every generation and comes back asking for something else." She paused, and the pause itself, several analysts later noted, did more diplomatic work than most speeches manage in their entirety. "You are not actually fighting about a mining consortium," she said. "You're fighting about whether an apology that was never properly given 200 years ago is still owed. I think you both already know that. I think that's exactly why nobody's said it out loud yet in 36 hours of increasingly serious military posturing. So I am going to say it, because apparently somebody without a fleet to lose has to be the one to start." What followed was not a treaty in any conventional sense, and certainly nothing that resembled the kind of decisive military intervention the Assembly's founding protocols had always assumed a crisis of this magnitude would require. Elinor Voss spent the next 11 hours doing something closer to what she had spent 40 years doing in library archives across 4 continents. Patiently, methodically walking both delegations back through the actual documented uncomfortable history of the second compression, the parts that had been smoothed out of the official record, the coercion nobody had wanted to name, the genuine grievance underneath 2 centuries of careful diplomatic silence, not to assign blame but simply to make sure both sides were, for the first time in 200 years, arguing about the thing they were actually angry about. Instead of a mining consortium that had never been the real issue at all. It did not resolve 2 centuries of grievance in 11 hours. Nothing could have. What it did, which turned out to matter considerably more in the moment that counted, was give both fleet commanders something neither had possessed 36 hours earlier. An actual named specific starting point for a conversation, rather than an ever-escalating dispute over a symptom neither side had been willing to diagnose. The Kthess traditionalist faction, confronted publicly for the first time with the full, undistorted history of the settlement they had spent a decade quietly relitigating in private, found their position considerably harder to sustain once it was no longer possible to frame the dispute as an abstract question of ancient honor, and instead had to be argued specifically and uncomfortably. as a demand that the HFY formally name and apologize for a coercion that KTHES officers themselves had, for 200 years, agreed to help keep unspoken. The HFY Fleet Marshal, for his part, made the choice that ultimately ended the standoff, not a military decision in the end, but the one thing no previous assembly protocol had ever anticipated a fleet marshal being asked to do. He apologized. Publicly, specifically on the record, for an event 2 centuries old that his own species had never formally acknowledged, because Elinor Voss had spent 11 hours patiently establishing, through nothing more exotic than careful historical documentation, that the apology was not actually a concession of weakness at all, but the single overdue action standing between the coalition and a war neither side could actually afford to win. The crisis ended without a single shot fired, a fact that assembly military historians would spend years afterward trying to reconcile with everything their own protocols had assumed about how coalitions this fragile actually survived their worst moments. Vorekthal Senu, the KTHES war priest who had called Elinor's arrival an insult in front of the full honor guard, found her afterward in the same archive room where she had spent so many of her quiet afternoons, and stood in the doorway for a long moment before speaking, in a voice considerably less certain than the one he had used 2 months earlier. "My own lineage helped keep that silence for 200 years, he said. I called you an insult to warriors who had bled for their people. I did not consider that the thing my people actually needed was not another warrior, but someone willing to make us say plainly what the BL Zeeding had actually been for." Elinor did not gloat and did not pretend the moment required less honesty than it deserved. "You weren't wrong to be skeptical," she said. "A civilization that trusts every stranger who shows up with a book bag instead of a weapon isn't being wise, it's being careless. I'd have thought less of you if you hadn't questioned me. I just needed you to keep questioning me long enough to actually watch what I was doing instead of stopping at what I looked like." Vorekthal Senu considered this, then did something no assembly record showed any war priest of his lineage ever having done before. He sat down on the table in front of her, the ceremonial blade every KTHES war priest carried as a mark of rank, not as a surrender. But as he explained, in the single-sentence assembly translators struggled longest to render precisely, as an acknowledgement that the credential he had spent his whole life relying on had just been quietly outperformed by one he had never been trained to recognize as a credential at all. "I do not think you want this," he said. "I do not think it means to you what it means to me. But I would like you to know that I understand now what my grandmother's generation lost when it decided a scar told the whole story of what a person could do for their people." Coordinator Thes Val Oren, meeting with Elinor Voss 3 days after the standoff formally concluded, asked her the question that had been building in him since her arrival, in a tone that suggested he already suspected he would not fully like the answer. "We built our entire first contact assessment of your species around the assumption that your strength was military," he said. "We are now uncertain what to build in its place." Elinor considered this over her tea for a long moment, in the same unhurried way she had once considered whether a damaged manuscript was worth the years of restoration work it would require. "You're not wrong that we're violent," she said. "I won't pretend otherwise. We've spent most of our history proving it over and over in ways I've cataloged more of than I'd like. But the thing your surveillance drones couldn't see, because it doesn't look like anything from orbit, is that we've also spent that same history refusing to let any of it be forgotten. Every atrocity, every treaty, every broken promise somewhere, some stubborn person made sure it got written down, and some equally stubborn person after them made sure it stayed findable. We elected not to send you our finest general. We sent you the thing that's actually kept our worst impulses from destroying us outright. Someone who understands that the truth, patiently and carefully kept, is the only weapon that never runs out of ammunition, and the only peace treaty that never fully rots from the inside." Thes Val Oren was quiet for a long time after that. When he finally spoke, it was not as coordinator of the Varan assembly, but several observers later noted, simply as a person who had just understood something true about the species his entire civilization had spent a decade preparing to fear. "I do not think we asked the right question at the beginning," he said. "We asked what humanity's strongest weapon was. We should have asked what your species has never allowed itself to lose. I suspect those questions have very different answers, and I am no longer certain we understood which one actually determines how a war or a peace eventually ends." Final entry VRRIN Assembly Diplomatic Archive. First Contact Division DCLASSIFID. First Contact Assessment, revised in full. Original threat model based on military capability retracted as incomplete. Supplementary assessment appended per Special Envoy Elinor Voss's recommendation. Second Compression Settlement, formally reopened, renegotiated, and closed with full historical acknowledgement on both sides. Assembly cohesion, according to internal review, assessed as measurably stronger following the resolution than at any point in the prior 2 centuries of careful, unspoken silence. Special Envoy Voss has declined all offers of formal diplomatic rank within the newly established Terran Assembly Liaison Office, requesting instead a modest posting establishing a joint historical archive between all 7 assembly species and Earth. A project she describes, in her own words, as making sure nobody on either side gets to conveniently forget anything, ever again, no matter how much easier it might feel in the moment. Coordinator Thess Val Oren has requested her assistance in reviewing 4 additional historical disputes within Assembly territory. Disputes his own government had, until recently, believed fully and permanently settled. "We came expecting to meet humanity's strongest warrior. We met, instead, a retired librarian who spent 40 years learning that the most dangerous thing any people can do to themselves is agree to forget something inconvenient. And D, who came to us not to demonstrate her species' capacity for violence, but to make certain, patiently and without a single weapon in hand, that we never mistook our own silences for peace again. If she still has not stopped smiling, we have stopped finding it strange." Zend log.